Evelyn Hart had always believed that unconditional love could fix anything. For over 60 years, she had poured her heart into raising her only son, Mason, a boy she once thought carried the best of her within him. After losing her husband early in life, Evelyn built a quiet, dignified life in a charming, colonial home tucked along the historic neighborhoods of Charleston, South Carolina. Her days were filled with gardening, reading old novels, and waiting for the phone calls that came less and less. When Mason called that morning, his voice cheerful and filled with excitement about his wife Ava's pregnancy, Evelyn's heart swelled. He told her the baby needed proper nutrition, and Evelyn, without hesitation, wired him $330,000, her entire retirement savings. She thought it was love. She thought it was trust. But as she was about to hang up, Evelyn heard a voice in the background, the voice of Ava, cold and smug. Finally, the old lady sent the money. That single sentence shattered decades of devotion. Evelyn stood frozen, phone trembling in her hand. And in that moment, something inside her cracked, not just from heartbreak, but from the terrifying realization her son had turned into a stranger. 2 days after that soul-crushing phone call, Evelyn heard a knock at the door, an unfamiliar sound after years of living alone. When she opened it, there stood Mason with Ava, both dressed in pastel tones and artificial smiles, like a couple from a real estate brochure. "Hey, Mom," Mason grinned, placing a large paper bag into her arms. "Brought you some vitamins, you know, for your joints and stuff." Evelyn forced a soft smile. "That's thoughtful, sweetheart. Come in." Ava's syrupy voice followed quickly. "Evelyn, Mason talks about you all the time. We've just been so busy with the baby and, well, life." Her hand caressed her flat stomach as if nurturing a lie. Inside, Mason flopped on the couch like he owned it. He glanced at Ava, then turned to Evelyn. "So listen, our apartment's really cramped, and with the baby coming, it's not safe. We were thinking maybe we could stay here for a while?" Evelyn nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "Of course, this is your home too." But Mason wasn't done. "Actually, it might make sense to put the house in my name. I can handle the property taxes, maintenance, all that, just to take it off your plate." Ava chimed in, her voice a velvet dagger. "You've done more than enough, Evelyn. You should be relaxing, not stressing over bills." Evelyn looked at them, smiled, and replied with a gentle, "Sure." Both of them blinked, surprised by how easily she agreed. Ava's smile twitched at the edges. Mason scratched the back of his neck, unsure whether they'd won too quickly or if something was off. That night, Evelyn lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Goofy the terrier curled at her feet. The house, her sanctuary, was beginning to feel foreign, like a stage set for a performance she never auditioned for. She remembered the way Mason used to call her every week, beg for help, cry over debts, make promises he never kept. She'd forgiven him every time, but this was different. The next morning, Ava stood in the kitchen in a designer robe, her voice sweet but insistent. "Evelyn, how's the paperwork coming along for the deed transfer?" Stillness filled the air. Evelyn met her gaze. "A few more days. It's more complicated than I thought." Ava's mask slipped for half a second, just a flicker of frustration. But she caught it and laughed, brushing it off. No rush. Of course they'd wait. They had no choice. Evelyn watched them move through the house like they owned it. Mason wiping counters he never cared about. Ava baking cookies and cooing like June Cleaver. But it was all theater. She knew that behind the courtesy and fake affection, a darker truth lurked, one far more dangerous than entitlement or greed. And when Goofy suddenly went missing a few days later, that truth would begin to surface in the most horrifying way. This wasn't a family reunion. It was a setup. And Evelyn? She had just started to plan her response. The sun had barely crept over the rooftops when Evelyn Hart noticed something wrong. She reached out instinctively to pat the soft fur at the edge of her bed. But Goofy, her 12-year-old terrier and closest companion, wasn't there. A small chill ran through her chest. Maybe he had wandered off downstairs. She slid into her slippers, calling softly, "Goofy, come here, boy." No sound, no jingle of his collar, no excited tail wagging in the hallway. Her steps quickened. She searched under the dining table, by the fireplace, in his favorite corner by the laundry room. Nothing. His water bowl was untouched, his food dish empty. "Goofy!" Her voice cracked as she flung open the back door and stepped into the dew-soaked yard. The birds chirped, the wind rustled gently, but her dog was gone. Panic started to bloom. Goofy never left the yard. He was old, slow, and too loyal to stray. Something was terribly wrong. She marched back inside, her breath shaky, her mind racing. She found Mason and Ava casually eating breakfast at the dining table like nothing had happened. "Have either of you seen Goofy?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm. Mason didn't even look up from his plate. "Oh, the mutt! I got rid of him this morning, dropped him off somewhere. He was always underfoot." Ava smirked as she sipped her juice. "Honestly, Evelyn, he was a hazard. You're not getting any younger. What if you tripped?" Evelyn's world stopped. The blood drained from her face. Her knees threatened to buckle. "You got rid of him?" Her voice trembled, a tremor of disbelief wrapped in grief. "He's just a dog," Mason muttered. "It's not like he meant anything." Goofy was everything. He had been her protector when she was too heartbroken to sleep, her comfort on silent nights. The only creature who never took from her, only gave. And now he was gone, discarded, like her love meant nothing. Evelyn sat down slowly at the edge of the couch, staring blankly at the coffee table. A photo sat there, her and Goofy, taken years ago when he was just a pup. Her eyes filled with tears, but none fell. The grief turned to something sharper. She'd forgiven Mason for 1,000 things, the gambling, the lies, the manipulation. But not this. This wasn't just betrayal. It was erasure. The one pure piece of her life. Gone. Her fingers clenched around the edge of her sweater. Her heart didn't ache anymore. It burned. That night, Evelyn didn't sleep. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table, staring at a document she'd once kept hidden, a carefully folded insurance policy. The name printed across the bottom was hers, but not the signature. In her gut, she knew. Mason had taken out $1 million life insurance policy on her, forging her approval. And tomorrow, he and Ava wanted to take her on a relaxing hike in the mountains. They thought she was blind, weak, easy, but they had no idea. Evelyn Hart was about to give them a lesson they'd never forget. Evelyn stood at the kitchen sink, staring at the cloudy reflection of herself in the window. The same hands that once held Mason as a newborn were now trembling, not with fear, but with fury. She had been played, lied to, robbed of her peace, her dignity, and worst of all, Goofy. Her son, her own flesh and blood, had looked her in the eyes and tossed away the one being that had loved her without condition. That morning, as Ava barked at her from the living room to bring some decent coffee, Evelyn simply nodded and complied. Her face was calm, her steps slow, but her mind was sharper than ever. Later, while cleaning the living room, her eyes landed on Mason's laptop left carelessly open on the couch. Normally, she would never pry, but this time, something pushed her. What she saw made her blood freeze. Search terms: how to make a death look like an accident, best remote hiking spots with cliffs, payout process for elderly life insurance policies. She closed the lid slowly, her heart pounding in her chest like a war drum. They didn't just want her house, they wanted her gone. And suddenly the world snapped into sharp focus. The fake pregnancy, the lavish spending, the hiking trip. Everything had been a setup. But Evelyn wasn't the woman they thought she was. She had lived through worse than this: a failed marriage, bankruptcy, raising a child alone while working double shifts. She had walked through fire and never asked for applause. And now she would walk through this too, alone, but not powerless. The next morning, Mason announced a spontaneous hiking trip with faux excitement. Ava clung to Evelyn's arm like a devoted daughter-in-law, apologizing for her recent attitude and promising a fresh start. Evelyn smiled warmly. "Sounds lovely. I'd love to go." They were stunned at how easy it was. That evening, she sat on her bed, her travel bag open on the quilt. She packed light, just water, a few granola bars, and an emergency flare she kept from her mountaineering club days. Her breath was steady, her heart was calm. She wasn't scared anymore. She was ready. This wasn't a retreat into the wilderness. This was war. And she didn't need to shout, fight, or beg for love anymore. Love hadn't saved her. It had blinded her. What would save her now was strategy, silence, and patience. She took one last glance at the photo of Goofy on her dresser and whispered, "I'm going to make them regret everything." When she turned off the lamp, the room was cloaked in darkness. But for the first time in years, Evelyn Hart wasn't afraid of the dark. She was becoming it. The next morning, Evelyn sat silently in the passenger seat of Mason's SUV as they drove deeper into the forest. The paved roads gave way to gravel, and soon even that disappeared into winding dirt trails. The further they got from civilization, the lighter her heart became. Ava babbled from the back seat about fresh air and new beginnings, her voice as hollow as the promises she'd whispered days before. When they arrived at the state park, Mason parked near the trailhead and turned to Evelyn with a bright smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ready for a hike, Mom?" She nodded. Beautiful day for it. They began climbing the trail. The air was crisp, filled with pine and the distant call of birds. As they neared the overlook, a place notorious among locals for its steep, unguarded cliffs, Mason handed her a bottle of electrolyte drink. "Thought you might need a little boost," he said, too casually. Evelyn took it, raised it to her lips, but didn't swallow. She let the cool liquid touch her tongue before slipping it back into the bottle. Beside her, Ava and Mason exchanged the subtlest of glances. Perfect, she thought. "I brought snacks too," Evelyn said sweetly, digging into her bag. She handed each of them an energy bar, carefully repackaged to look untouched. The ones they had unknowingly drugged to use on her, she had simply returned the favor. Within minutes, as they walked further into the woods, Mason's steps slowed. Ava stumbled slightly. Their voices grew sluggish. Then Mason dropped to his knees, blinking rapidly. What the hell?" Evelyn turned, her face calm as ever. "Oh, don't stop now," she said gently. "We're almost at the top." They both collapsed in a heap by the side of the trail. Evelyn stood over them, her expression unreadable. "You thought I was some senile old woman with no fight left, but you forgot. I've survived worse storms than either of you could imagine." She knelt, adjusted her backpack, and began walking back down the trail. She didn't need to leave them to die. That wasn't her way. But she'd leave them just long enough to feel fear, to feel vulnerable, to understand what it meant to be completely, terrifyingly alone. Halfway down the mountain, Evelyn heard something. Weak cries for help from off the main path. Her instincts kicked in. She followed the sound and discovered a man collapsed in the brush, his leg twisted at a sickening angle. "Can you call for help?" he gasped. She didn't hesitate. Her fingers moved swiftly on her phone. Hours later, she sat quietly at the hospital as the man recovered. His name was Leonard Graham, executive director of the Graham Group, an elite firm Mason had been desperately chasing for funding. He looked at her with grateful eyes. "You saved my life. If there's anything I can do." Evelyn smiled gently. "You don't owe me anything." But inside she knew. Fate had just handed her a key, and this time, she wasn't going to leave the door closed. Evelyn Hart returned home the following afternoon, the mountain air still clinging to her coat. She stood in the foyer of her house, and looked around with fresh eyes. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was peaceful. Goofy's absence still ached, but the pain had turned into purpose. Mason and Ava hadn't returned yet, and that gave her time. She began cleaning, not just the house, but the residue of their presence. She threw away the designer toiletries Ava had lined across her bathroom shelf, packed up their clutter into boxes, deleted their fingerprints from her world, one drawer at a time. The next morning, she visited a lawyer. By the time Mason and Ava returned, disheveled, shaken, and pale, Evelyn was already steps ahead. They barely asked about the hike. They were too distracted, too unsure if they'd been caught, and Evelyn played her role perfectly. "I must have blacked out," she said, rubbing a fake bandage on her ankle. "The park ranger found me a few hours later. I was lucky." Ava blinked. "You don't remember anything?" Evelyn shook her head with just enough uncertainty. "Not really, but I'm just glad we're all okay." The next few weeks passed like a slow play unraveling. Evelyn cooked. She cleaned. She smiled sweetly when Ava snapped orders, or when Mason sighed about work stress. But all the while, she documented everything. Every bank transaction they made, every demand, every threat. And when the time was right, she offered them one last gift, a luxurious vacation to Thailand, 7 days, fully paid. They didn't hesitate. Once their plane lifted off the runway, Evelyn got to work. She contacted her financial advisor, reassigned all accounts. She cleared every room of their belongings, shipped them to a local shelter, changed the locks, updated the deed filings, and activated the alarm system. By the time they returned, sunburnt and broke, they found themselves locked out of a life they thought they owned. The final blow came in a manila envelope, a detailed invoice of every dollar spent during their trip, all of it charged to Mason's credit line, not Evelyn's. He called her, voice wild with rage. "You tricked us! You stole from me!" Evelyn's voice was calm, like a still lake before dawn. "I didn't steal anything, Mason. You just never read the fine print. Much like that house transfer form you signed, for display purposes only, not legally binding." He came to her door, fist pounding. Vanessa screamed, "We let you stay here. This was our home." Evelyn opened the door just enough to meet their eyes. "Number I let you stay, and now your stay is over." She handed them a second envelope, a DNA test result. Mason's face paled as he read the truth. He wasn't her biological son. She had raised him out of kindness, not obligation. And now that kindness had run dry. As she shut the door, Evelyn smiled. Not in triumph, but in freedom. She was no longer living for Mason. She was finally living for herself. The hospital smelled faintly of antiseptic and wilted lilies as Evelyn Hart stood outside room 314. She didn't rush. She didn't cry. She simply watched through the glass as Mason and Ava lay in separate beds, pale and weak, hooked to IV drips. Stress, malnutrition, fatigue. The doctors said the collapse was a combination of it all. But Evelyn knew better. Their downfall had never been physical. It was spiritual. A life built on greed, finally caving in on itself. She stepped into the room silently. Mason looked up with bloodshot eyes. "Mom, I'm sorry." Evelyn sat beside him and gently rolled up her sleeve, revealing a clean wrist. "Are you?" He swallowed. I didn't know how to stop." "You never tried," she said softly. "And I never forced you to. That was my mistake." Vanessa turned her face toward the wall. There was no apology there, only pride, wounded and cornered. Evelyn stood. "You won't recover here, but maybe someday you'll grow from this." And then she walked away, for good. Weeks passed. Spring rolled in slowly, coating Charleston in lavender wisteria and golden sun. Evelyn filled her days with simplicity. Long walks, library trips, fresh herbs growing on her back patio. She turned her kitchen into a sanctuary again, one where every dish was cooked for joy, not to appease, but she wasn't alone anymore. Leonard Graham had begun stopping by every Thursday, sometimes with books, sometimes with flowers, and always with kindness. He never overstepped, never rushed her healing. He simply showed up, again and again, a steady presence in a world that had once been so unstable. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch, sipping iced tea, Leonard looked over at her. "You know," he said, "you're the strongest woman I've ever met." Evelyn smiled, the lines around her eyes softening. "I never wanted to be strong. I just wanted to be loved." "You still can be," he replied gently, "and this time, you get to choose how." Later that evening, Evelyn pulled an old photograph from a drawer. It was of Goofy, eyes bright, tongue lolling, a blur of joy in a world that had forgotten how to be gentle. She pressed the frame to her chest and whispered, "We made it, boy." She never did hear from Mason again. Maybe he vanished into the debt he created. Maybe he started over. She didn't chase the answer. Some doors were meant to remain closed. Evelyn's story was no longer about fixing broken people. It was about becoming whole herself. And so, under a setting sun and a sky brushed in pastel gold, she reached for Leonard's hand, rested it in hers, and finally, after decades of loving everyone else first, allowed herself to be loved in return. Not because she was needed, but because she was enough. Evelyn Hart's story is a painful but powerful reminder. Unconditional love should never mean unconditional sacrifice. She spent her entire life believing that if she gave enough, time, money, patience, her son would eventually love her back. But some people only take. And if you keep pouring from your cup without boundaries, you'll wake up empty. True strength isn't about enduring abuse quietly. It's about knowing when to walk away. Evelyn didn't stop loving Mason, but she finally stopped allowing his entitlement to define her worth. And when she chose herself, the universe responded, not with fireworks, but with steady, genuine care. A second chance, a new connection, a life she never thought she could live. Sometimes freedom doesn't come with a bang. It comes with a quiet realization. You're enough, even without anyone's approval. And when you finally choose peace over people-pleasing, that's when healing begins. Many older adults, especially parents, struggle with guilt when setting boundaries, especially with children. But Evelyn's story shows the critical importance of protecting your emotional and financial well-being. If someone constantly drains your energy, resources, or spirit, it's okay to say no, even if they're family. Evaluate your relationships honestly. Ask yourself, am I being valued or just used? Set clear boundaries. Create a will. Protect your assets. And if something feels wrong, trust your instincts. Seek legal or emotional support if needed. You're not selfish for choosing peace. You're wise. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this, please like and share with your friends. Your support keeps these stories alive. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a new episode. And if today's story touched your heart, leave a comment. I'd love to hear from you. Take care, stay well, and see you in the next story.